The following presentation is a production of Ride the Wave Media.
Hello and welcome back to Practically Magick. This is Courtney Pearl, your host and your local folk witch. I have a co-host with me today.
I'm Amanda Norr, and I am a 4 times international best-selling author of some co-authored books. My first book was Lunar Wisdom, and I personally have sold 100 copies of Lunar Wisdom, and I was told by my publisher that only 10% of self-published authors ever sell that many copies.
Yay!
And I'm also a professional card reader that takes the personal development slant in reading the cards. So it's got a coaching element, and I do, am a certified moonologer as well. So I do moon readings and help people work with their astrological chart to work with the energies of the moon. I've done that for Courtney, and yeah.
Yes, which is so helpful in learning about myself, because I often refer to it when I'm like, let me just ask this question, like, why is this happening and what is going on? And I go back to my chart. Not that I can read most of it. It's very complicated, but I can at least get some ideas about myself. It's helped me time and time again, is what I'm saying.
You kind of get a simplified down and dirty, you know, but enough that then you can go, okay, the moon is doing this. How does that impact me? So,
yes, helped me so much. So here we are. We've been discovering true and real magic in the world. And so we're here to share it with you today. And we've each decided to pull a card. I don't happen to have the Season of the Witch Oracle deck for Mabon, which is what our topic of this episode is going to be about. But no worries, Amanda did. The universe provides. So tell us what card you pulled for us today.
All right. So I pulled the Harvest Moon card. I don't know, like if you can see that. It's very ominous and beautiful. And it talks, the harvest moon is the full moon around the fall equinox. So that's going to be on the 17th, and then we'll have the equinox. And the card is about adapting and adopting to a slower pace, which is what we do this time of year, right? We're going into fall. Things are going into hibernation. So, and then winter comes, and so now is not the time to start like pushing and doing a lot. But, and then in that slower pace, it really talked about being guided to understand our self-care needs. So maybe one day you need to dance, clothed or not, in your living room and scream. Maybe another day you need to go on a walk. Maybe you need to go have lunch with a friend a different day. But it's being in tune, taking that slower pace and then thinking of what your needs are and finding ways to meet them. So
perfect.
And I think that's perfect for this episode, because that is kind of what we're going to be doing.
Yes, listeners, we are here to facilitate and guide you into your descent. And we're going to circle back on that too at the end of the episode, because I have plans to kind of wrap it up, that same message. And I think it's perfect that you pulled that card. I was using the Magical Nordic deck, and I pulled the Ace of Wands. So before we started, we were kind of on this like tarot geeking out moment where we're talking about, are wands fire element? Are they air element? And I was saying I typically read an air element unless the deck is, proves otherwise, I guess. It depends on the deck. But for me, I tend to read it more as the air element, which is the mind and communication and thinking. And as you were talking about the harvest moon, I was actually just thinking, this is for me a really great time of year to do all my like planning, kind of my like, I don't know, my inward work, if that makes sense. Just kind of like, let me lay out my schedule. Let me lay out my plan for the winter and for going into the season. And I kind of like do all that sort of mental work. But it actually says on the card, new adventures, which I love, because you were talking about you going through some new adventures, hoping, this
Staying
career.
hopeful, send all the good vibes, but it's going to stay on the DL till I get notification.
When you find out if you're going to be taking this new adventure and all of that. But a lot of people listening right now might be in that same kind of space where it's like, it's almost like the start of a new school year is kind of a lot of people's New Year's.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking.
And it kind of depends on your astrological chart too. So some people, it does feel like new beginnings for them during the fall time, because they're like, okay, now what? Like now we're settling into fall, going towards winter and looking ahead. What do I want out of this? Like, what's going to happen for me? Right. Perfect. Well, I want to start. So we're talking about Mabon. We're talking about the fall equinox. And I want to start with just kind of addressing and recognizing that the name Mabon was kind of thrown in as like, let's, mark this milestone. Of course, the ancient ancestors and pagans of old, they had their ways of marking certain times of the year, but it wasn't until kind of the Wiccan tradition that they decided to put it, with names on it and, kind of slap on some names. Mabon was slapped on. I'm just going to say it. It wasn't necessarily associated with the equinox. It was a story from Welsh mythology. Mabon is the son of Modron, who is like the great mother. Modron meaning the great mother and Mabon being the great son. It's kind of a Christ archetype sort of storyline where King Arthur is involved. He comes to look for Mabon because the prophecy says he's the only one that can save the people from this terrible boar that is wreaking havoc on villages. So King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, they go looking for Mabon. They go to his mother first, but he was stolen from his mother when he was only 3 days old. So Modron has cried all the rivers of the seas and oceans. She's grieved for her son. She's been missing him for years. And here comes this king, and he's like, hey, have you seen your son? We're kind of looking for him. And she's like, of course not. I've been looking. She's like, I'm crying the tears of the ocean, okay?
Why would I be going through this if I have seen him?
You would know if I had him. So she's like, go ask the blackbird for all I care. Like, she kind of flippantly says it like, you jerk. And Arthur goes to the blackbird because maybe he doesn't get sarcasm. I don't know. But he goes to the blackbird and he's like, where is Mabon, son of Modron? And the blackbird sends him on this wild goose chase where he's like, go find the oldest animal. And I'm going to just briefly go through it, but I will do a storytelling episode with this because it's a great story. But he goes to the stag, and the stag says, I don't know, go ask the owl. So they go to the owl, and they're like, I don't know, go ask the eagle. And the eagle says, I don't know, go ask the oldest animal, which is the salmon. And in Celtic folklore, salmon often represents knowledge. So it makes sense that he would go. The Druids are known to, or believed by historians to really honor the rivers, fish being sacred, that kind of thing. So finally, Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table go to the salmon and say, hey, we're looking for Mabon, son of Modron. Have you seen him? And he's like, did you ask his mother? That's my favorite part. It's like the Welsh people had a sense of humor, obviously. Really? And so Arthur's like, yeah, we did. She doesn't know where he is. And the salmon's like, well, actually, I have seen light coming from a castle, far up the river. And I can take you, but I can only take 2 men at a time. So you will come with me, King Arthur, and we will bring Mabon back with us. And so that's what happens. And he's like the savior. He's like the Christ child. He's the one that comes back to save the people from the boar. So even though Mabon has like little to nothing to do with the story, he is the savior. And he comes back with Arthur, which, by the way, Arthur is associated with bear in Welsh language. Arth means bear. And so there is some relationship to perhaps the North Star and the bear in the sky, the constellation, the bear. Just a little history for those who love that kind of stuff.
Little geeky side. No, it's totally fine.
So there you have it. That's the story of Mabon. And as you can see, doesn't really have a whole lot to do with the equinox. But some traditions have adapted over time to become just part of something that we now associate it with. And some people like Mabon being part of the equinox because it's sort of a Demeter and Persephone story. Like when Persephone returns, spring comes back. This is when the time of year when Persephone leaves to go to Hades in the underworld. And so Demeter is so aggrieved the loss of her daughter that we get winter and the dead, and Demeter being the goddess of harvest. This is harvest season, right?
It definitely.
So yeah, so stories change. Stories take on new meaning, and I kind of like that there is sort of an aspect you can relate it to this time of year and the descent into winter for this time.
So something so super interesting, right? So as I learned about the wheel of the year, right, and it's kind of more of a modern take on things. I grew up on a farm. I married a farmer. So I have been a farmer for almost 46 years, right? And until I really started connecting with the moon and with the cycles and the seasons, I mean, I always know it's harvest time, right? We always harvest the corn in September. That's a thing. And the thing with Mabon on the wheel, when we talk about the whole wheel, it's considered the third harvest, or I've heard it called witches' Thanksgiving. And it honestly makes more sense to have Thanksgiving in September than November, because that's when more things are available. But it's true. And then the third harvest. So it's out, because we do start harvesting. So the first harvest is the 1st of June, right? Because you plant everything in the spring. So we do the first harvest. I mean, you end up with 3 or 4 crops of hay and other things throughout the year. But then you hit August time. That's when you're harvesting the wheat and things like that. And then this is the time, right, where peaches are on, apples are on. You're going to start later in the month, you start getting more pumpkins and squashes and things like that. And then I worked at a fruit stand for a few years when my kids were in high school. So it's really interesting when you start not a lot of people have that experience where you're out working in the land.
Yeah.
And so when you actually line that up, and again, it's for the Northern Hemisphere, because clearly I have friends in Australia and they are not the same. Right. But yeah, it's just reversed. But that cycle. And then taking that cycle and applying it to ourselves, right? So in the spring, I'm planting, during the winter, I was frozen, and kind of nurturing under the earth. And then I'm planting myself come spring, and then I'm harvesting along the year. And now again, we're at this time of the year where we're plucking kind of the final growth, celebrating that. And we're now slowing down for the winter again. So that's one thing that has been interesting for me, because I'm because it's right. I mean, I go ride in the tractors with my husband. I would never consider it an actual farming year if we didn't have a tractor date at least once, right? Where I go buy milkshakes and then we ride and whatever. But it's only been the last few years where it's I actually go outside and I look in the sky and I pay attention to the ground, and I'm more connected. And it's a whole different perspective.
Yeah. And isn't it interesting? So, I mean, as a farmer, I could see how that directly links you to that cycle, that land, that acknowledging the relationship we have with land. And that's kind of the journey that you and I have been on, even separately. So it's fascinating. We were just talking before we started recording about how we've known each other. I'm from Box Elder County, where she lives, and we've known each other for what, 20 years?
It feels like it. I think my daughter's 24, and she was in 1st or 2nd grade.
She was young when we were dancing together. She was my dance teacher. Yeah. But I think it's fascinating that how many people have shifted from kind of a traditional Christian dogma or faith and have adopted sort of a pagan spirituality in some sense or another. I would like to do a whole episode about that, just that, but
For sure.
we separately kind of did that. We sort of, came to a place where we're like realizing or awakening to this idea that there's something missing. There's something we weren't quite understanding about the natural world and the spirituality of that. And we did kind of come to those same kind of concepts separately. Now, like coming back together and being like, you too? Me too.
At the same time. Like I started following you, I was like, oh, and like you would kind of pop up on social media because we've been friends for so long. And then I'm like, wait, I was like, she's studying Mary Magdalene. Like I just read this book and I'm starting this thing. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And then you were like, there was something else you did. And I was like, wait a minute, what? And then I did my moon thing and you were doing like your art processing, but then like we like kind of crossed those. And then I'm like feeling this draw, like I need to really get in to study more Celtic mythology. That's a lot where my ancestry is. And then it's like, and then you're like going to Glastonbury. And then I asked you about the class. It's like, then we're taking this class at the same time. It's just been.
Yes. And that's kind of
so funny.
It is so interesting. And we're not alone. I mean, that's what's really important to understand is that like, that's kind of the group Nourishing Kin that we both came a part of. And we're going to celebrate Mabon together this weekend at Nourishing Kin. But it's a group of women and people that have felt that sense of longing and maybe even kind of tension in how do we decolonize ourselves and understand our place as descendants of Northern European immigrants who came here and colonized this land and feel the kind of pain and loss and suffering that is associated with, but also honor this land we live on. But also we don't really totally belong in our home motherland either, even though that's where our traditions and folklore and mythology, that's where that comes from. But like if I were to go and just like immigrate all of a sudden to Ireland or Scotland, they would be like, you're not Scottish.
You're not one
you don't
of us.
belong here either, right?
You're a transplant.
Yeah, which is one of the first Nourishing Kin events that I went to, they were kind of talking about this idea of we've always kind of had one foot on the boat, right? Like we've always felt a little bit like, well, we could leave at any time, or this isn't really our land. And it really isn't like our stories, our culture, our folklore are not about these mountains and these valleys and these plants. That belongs to someone else who we colonized and pushed out.
Yeah.
But how do we reconcile that in being able to honor both the land we live on currently and where we come from, right?
And to add to that, again, farming, right? I grew up out on a farm. I live on a farm. Finding artifacts and signs that people were here first, right?
Yeah.
Like my cousin used to come home and he'd find all sorts of different obsidian and flint arrowheads, things that my husband and I were out hiking. We found, an arrowhead, it's like, so it's always being presented that, yeah, we own this land, right?
Yeah.
The deed says our name on it, but somebody was here first.
Right. Yeah.
And I thought that was interesting when you talked about having one foot in the boat, because I've not ever felt that. I've never felt like, oh, I could go there and connect because I'm so here, but yet somebody had to suffer for me to be here. But then my ancestors had to suffer to get here. And so for me, I feel it's very liminal.
Yeah.
So I have to work with the land I'm on and the plants that I'm on. And then I studying like the Celtic stuff. And I feel like it's liminal and I go in my head and it's almost like it connects, but it's very otherworldly because there isn't a place that I belong. And for me to start this journey, my mental health like totally tanked. I didn't want to be here anymore.
Yeah.
And then that's where I learned that an organization isn't where the love is. That even though I have neighbors and whatever, nobody could love me and give me what I needed. And all the hoops and all the checklists and everything that I was taught to live by, because that's where everything was going to make everything wonderful, was just like, no, this doesn't work. And I felt, I got married when I was 18 for a whole month. So by the time I was 20, and I'm living on a family farm, multi-generations, my husband's the 4th generation, and 3 generations were farming together. I always felt like, okay, like my husband, my father-in-law, and grandpa, they all have more control over my life and my future than I do.
Yeah.
And then let's add a religious organization that's all about men.
Yeah.
I mean, so from the age of 20, I am like, okay, there's like 20 to 21 men that have more control and say over my life and what I do than me as a woman.
Yeah.
And so the catalyst was my mental health tanking, and then going, wait a minute, like I was always taught there's a divine feminine. I was always taught there's a goddess. Where is she? Nobody talks about her. And so I'm like, okay, I'm going to start looking into the goddess archetype and all goddesses, right? And then when you bring in all the myths and how everything intertwines. And then I'm like, okay, I am sick of a man, regardless of who he is, telling me how to be a woman and how to be a divine feminine. That doesn't work anymore. And I think that's why so many of us are on this journey.
For sure.
Because men cannot tell us how to be women. They can tell us how they want us to be: quiet, small, submissive, revolve around them to make them happy. But when we start showing up with our words, we get burned.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is, I mean, and I love that you point out, because having grown up as a farmer, I think that gives you such a different edge on, I already know how it is to have that relationship with the land, or to even see it as the goddess itself, the mother who takes care of me, right? The mother that's here. And then, like you said, liminal space is the mother that I came from. And they can both occupy space in my mind.
And I didn't grow up connecting it with mother, but I would get frustrated when, you know, people are like, well, the farmers are trying to poison us and whatever. I am like, farmers, I've just always known farmers do more self-care and land rehab and are paying attention, even if they're using a pesticide or a herbicide, which everybody hates. They're putting more conscious effort into the earth and the land and preservation than anybody, because their entire livelihood and survival depends on it. And a lot of people don't understand that. And then same with like the animal husbandry, right? Because we had a dairy farm. We sold the cows last year. My husband was 4th generation on the dairy farm. My grandpa actually had milk cows before he went to sheep. I grew up with my grandpa having sheep and my other grandpa owning the woolen mill. And even with the animals, and everyone's like, oh, but the way animals are treated, like whatever. I'm like, I had 27 years of cows having better health care than me.
Yeah. That is so sad and so true.
You know, like they got preg checked, they got looked at. I mean, I did have maternity care, you know, with my pregnancies, but like if they didn't feel good, they got medicine, and we didn't have health insurance. And so if I didn't feel good, I got to lay on the couch and still figure out how to feed my kids, get them back and forth, and sleep as much as possible and heal, because I wasn't going to get a prescription and I wasn't going to get a doctor visit. And the cows got checked every year. Yeah. So it would get frustrating to me. But then, then as this journey, it's like, well, the land is the Mother Earth, and then there's the sovereignty and all that. Then it's just like, oh, this all makes more sense.
Yeah. All the connections.
And so with the stuff that I do with farming, I really I'm trying to embody and be that more, because again, more farmers are men than women, but there's actually more women farmers and more women owned farms than there's ever been too, which is incredible. And so it's kind of like, okay, let's shift our minds from, even though they're caring for it and it is a bit of a self-interest, but it's also because they really love to just work really hard and feed people that they don't know. I mean, that's literally what it is. They enjoy what they do, and they know they're serving the world because they're providing food for people that people, they don't do that, it's not going to be in the store. And yet let's shift that thing where it is more of the Mother Earth versus just, you know, it's a whole, it's really interesting to me.
Yeah. And that does kind of pull you back. Like the idea of like, what this harvest season represents for you with a more personal nature to where the food comes from directly from the earth, you're able to pull it back into what was this time of year really like for ancient people who were like, listen, if we don't get the food we need, like if we don't harvest enough, we don't survive winter. Like our children won't survive winter. So it really kind of puts that into perspective, even as we talk about, you know, celebrating this harvest season, understanding it within ourselves, but also kind of taking a moment to say physically, not just in a spiritual or traditional manner, but physically, this is what our ancestors would have been. So this is when they would have been making offerings to their deities and doing that spiritual work, because they would have been like, this is our survival.
And it's the culmination, right? It's the third harvest right now. And so it's the culmination of everything. And so in those offerings, you're offering gratitude because it's what you're going to live off of next.
Yeah.
And with the world economy, so everyone's got different climates.
Right.
So as people import and export in countries, that's like why we can get fresh fruit from Mexico when we can't grow it in like California and all that kind of stuff. But again, if we're not thinking, we're thinking spiritually, but we also need to think land, because if we didn't have people doing that, we'd go into the grocery store and have empty shelves.
Right. Yes. Thank you so much for bringing that forward. That is not something that I had even considered, and like thinking, what are we going to talk about with Mabon? Like, what do I want people to understand or take away from understanding what Mabon is to those of us who practice magic, or those of us who are in a spiritual realm, but also like why it matters to the world, no matter what you believe.
Wherever you live. Yeah. Yeah.
Wherever you live, whatever you do need to eat.
Yeah. So like in Australia, it's opposite. So
they're
they're planting right now, right? And we're harvesting, and then flip it.
Yeah.
When they're having their Mabon, that they're planting.
In bulk. Yeah.
So I was thinking like, because when we're having our Beltane, right? We're planting, but they're harvesting, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so the opposite wheels of the year.
Yeah.
And honestly, and this is why Nourishing Kin, or any kind of group that kind of just brings forward that, whether you're using the wheel of the year, the Wiccan calendar, you know, the way that they set it up, or whether you're just acknowledging that there's more to mark those occasions throughout the year, and to, I mean, just create kind of a mindfulness around what is this season about? What does this mean to me? Yeah. And for someone who, from my perspective, was not a farmer. my dad, we lived on a peach orchard, and my dad took out probably 3 peach trees on accident when we moved into our house, because he'd fire up the tractor and he'd be like, whoops. And he grew up there. That was his home, his family home from when he grew up. And yeah, we were not farmers. Let's just say that. Not great at the whole planting and harvesting. And I do try, but I think I sort of wrote it off as like, that's just not me. I'm not good at that, until I started to want that, and want like, what would it be to have a relationship with even my little suburban house in a little suburban yard? What would it be like to know every plant that grows in my yard, and every, you know, and to like have my hands in the dirt and have my own relationship with this land I live on, giving it the honor that it deserves and the relationship it deserves, that maybe some of those people that lived here, the indigenous people that lived on this land, would have done while they created their folklore and stories and mythology around these mountains, these plants, you know. So just being able to kind of marry that idea that, yes, I celebrate, and I come from a more Celtic ancestry, and I try to adapt that into my life as much as possible, It is more of a liminal space because I'm not there. Those mountains are not here with me. I have to imagine them. And then what do I have right here in front of me that is what I have? And marry those two ideas into just having relationship with land, right? Yeah. Okay, so I did kind of write down a couple of the, ancient traditions we talk about kind of during Mabon so that people who maybe aren't familiar with it would know, what is this? Why? What are we talking about? A lot of the people, when they did festivals, would do bonfires as, for practical reasons, because they're probably burning off things, dead things, diseased, plants and whatever excess things that they had to burn off. But it was also
and now's the time of the year, depending on where you live, that the wheat farm, they're burning their fields.
Yes.
They're burning the stubble so that it integrates back into the ground, that they can dig it up and have it ready for spring. So there's that fire aspect modernly too.
The fire, yeah. And then the symbolic death, fire and rebirth. It's just that those ashes and that is going to nourish the soil to be able to grow. You know more about that than I do. I'm like, nourish the soil. Here's how I nourish the soil. I take some of my hair and I'm like, here you go, plants.
Yeah. And the birdies will go, oh, that's good nesting material.
Yeah. Like, however you want to use it. It is also like to light the dark because we're going into the dark season. So it's sort of a symbolic gesture of, even if you were to be celebrating this time of year and lighting candles and lighting something that represents the fire in your house, you could do it that way. It's the Thanksgiving. Like you said, I think it's an even better time to do a Thanksgiving of thanks really for the abundance of this harvest. Gathering. It had a lot of associations with the goddess of harvest. The Celtic goddess of harvest was Bricacia or Bricaca. I might be saying it totally wrong. I was trying to kind of put that Welsh, like how would a Gaelic person, speaking Gaelic say it?
No, I still have. I downloaded Duolingo, but I haven't put Welsh on there yet. It's just sitting.
I'm doing my best, but when it comes to actually speaking it, it's a whole other thing. Yeah. I can translate a sentence pretty good by now, but not actually speak it. But she was the goddess of harvest, and she her name comes from the association of mead and harvesting the barley and the cereal crops in Northern European time of harvest. But porridge being the most common meal of the Middle Ages, this is kind of where that time of year comes from. But how do you personally, as more modern neo-pagans, how do you personally kind of prepare for the season?
So I'm pretty solitary, right? So the one thing I did was going to Nourishing Kin this weekend. I feel like I live so far away from everything cool because I'm up clear at the top end of Utah.
Like southern Idaho?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm closer to Idaho than I am to Salt Lake, legit. So, and everything cool happens in Salt Lake and Provo, whatever. So I usually just kind of do things myself. I'll pull a card. I've got those decks now. So now I'm like, oh, for this season, I pull a card and then I'll pull several cards throughout that time and just connect that way for myself. But it is going outside. And I did learn how, I'll have to explain this. I learned how to drive the swather this year. Okay. The swather is what we use to cut hay. So it's a nice big machine. It's huge. Big long teeth, that you just drive back and forth in the field and cut and makes the rows, and then the baler comes behind and puts it in the cubes,
Okay, sounds like an allergy worst nightmare, but all right.
I have allergies, crazily enough. They haven't bothered me doing that, so that's been kind of nice. And I think that's why I kind of, even though I love doing farm things, I backed off a lot because of allergies or raising kids.
Yeah.
I am not as talented as my husband to have a kid in a tractor with me and then do all the whatevers. But
wow.
Yeah. So for me now, it's I'm part of the harvest. I've, helped a little bit more with irrigating this year. Just a lot of those things. And then I'm just more intentional about it. When I'm outside and I'm on the side of the ditch and I'm looking at the crop and just kind of thinking more of the earth and the cycle that we're at and being outside. And I'm a crystal person, right? And I go to the crystal shops and spend a lot of money, but it's also really interesting because I mean, just dumb rocks that are around, but sometimes like this rock is like, pick me up, and I'll just, you know,
Oh yes, I know all about that.
right? So, and like, oh, it's just a rock. Like no one's gonna spend any money on it at the crystal shop, but it does something to me to just ground me. Or and then because I live in the mountains or around them, you see the color changes and whatever. So for me personally, I just get more intentional, and I like to use the wheel to just kind of mark it just so that I can bring that in. And since I'm pretty much the only person in my family that does it, I kind of just have to do it solo and on the quiet. Or like, I mean, I'll take the grandkids and like, well, let's go on a hike, or you know, things like that.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of
and a lot of people are practicing solitary witchcraft too. I mean,
and for me, I just kind of do what I'm drawn to. I've just really learned to follow my intuition and just to listen to myself. So you were talking about my new adventure that I'm hoping for.
Yeah.
And it started back in February. That's where the intention came. And I've been building and watching this intention and going through moon cycles and going through the season cycles, how things have gone, and then listening to myself. And I had to do like this very physical thing. So I'm like, okay, how do I build muscles? How do I get endurance? How do I push my lungs past their COVID scars and all that kind of stuff? And I'll say I've lost over 30 pounds since March.
Wow.
Everyone's like, oh, are you on the shot? Are you doing like this? And it's literally just every day I just body, what do I need to do today? How do I need to eat? I can stand in the kitchen and be like, okay, I need to eat something, but I don't know what, you know, and it's like protein. We want protein because we're building muscles. And so I've just taken the things that I've known, and then like, because one thing that I've done, and it just, everybody's like, that is like ridiculous. I have a 45-pound vest because I am on a volunteer fire department, and every year we have to do, it's called the pack test, where you wear 45 pounds, you have to walk 3 miles, and you have to do it in less than 45 minutes. So I buy my own vest to kind of just stay active. And then my husband has one. So I'd put the vest on, and then I'd put his vest on. So that's 90 pounds. And then I just go up and down my stairs because I was like, I need strength in my legs.
Yeah.
And
that's incredible.
The initial first thing I did was, because I was like, I don't even know what to do, was like, can I get down on my knees and stand up without having to grab on things? So I just did just little things to build up. And I've been doing that all year long.
Amazing.
And now we're at this point. So it's like.
Talk about you and I being part of the collective consciousness. So I was basically like a couple of months ago, you know, I had been gaining weight and I had been not mindful about what I was eating and how I was moving and things like that. But it wasn't really that kind of sparked it. It was more that listening to your body, and my body was like, I want to move. I want to move. I just kept having this feeling, or these urges to like run as fast as I could across a field, or just like, I wanted to go to bed tired, but not like in a, I'm just tired way, but like, I want to be exhausted physically. I want my body to feel tired, like that, like when you're walking Disneyland or something all day long and you're like, oh, I'm so tired.
Well, and
you fall into sleep.
Yeah. And I just wanted to be like, because I was like that. So like in my 20s, when I would exercise, I would overtrain, and I didn't. I'm doing more now than I did then, but I was always tired. Like, oh, I can exercise and make dinner. It was like all I had energy for ever. And so I was really afraid for a long time. Like, I don't want to do something, so I'm always tired, and then I can't deal with stuff. But when you talk about running, like I'm going on a walk, and then all of a sudden, like a song would hit in my phone, and then I'm running, and I am like, why am I running? Yeah. I hate to run. This really sucks. And my body's like, well, this is what we want to do because it's going to help. Yeah. Okay. So I do go on runs now, but I don't like it still.
I know. I understand that.
When my body
deep
says we're
in my
running, I'm like,
bones.
okay, I guess we're running. And then my lungs are like, whoo, and it's like, but that's building that endurance that I need. So it's like, okay.
Yeah. And I have heard a lot of, you know, kind of mystics and people in the kind of world and language we speak that have said that Mabon is a really great time for grounding and embodiment. So I'm thinking this was all related to the time of year too, of just being able to recognize how much of what I'm doing is just, you know, subconscious programming, or how much of it is, am I really listening to my body? Am I mindful about like what my body is asking for, what it needs? And am I trusting and embracing the wisdom of what my body has to offer, rather than just being like, oh, I got to get on a diet and a exercise plan, and I got to do, you know, all these things that work for everybody else, but being more like mindful about your own body and your personal choices.
Yeah. And so when people ask me, it's like, well, and then if I muscle test, and they just look at me like, I'm like, well, I get this intuitive thing, like this is what I should do. And then I'm like, am I sure? So then I'll muscle test. I'm like, yes, go do this. And
yeah. The kinesiology muscle testing is a super powerful, helpful tool in those moments too.
Taught my daughter, because she had allergies all as a kid, and we could never find the right thing for her. So we would just lay out the different medications, and we would just muscle test which to take and how much, just to control her allergies. Yeah. And so even in college, she'd call me and be like, Mom, I need you to muscle test this for me. I'm driving. Like, yeah. And so I was like, okay, like I know it works. So that's what I do. And
yeah, it's always worked very well for me.
So what's working for me now, I was doing what I was told to do before. This is the exercise medicine. This is what you do. This is how you do it. And now I'm just like, my body feels like this today. My body feels like this today. You know, yeah, I want to eat this today. I'm not hungry today. I'm eating less. Oh, I want more carbs today. They're not so evil. Like, I don't know. It's just, yeah. Yeah. And then when you talk about grounding and embodiment, right? And the land we're on, like go stand outside with your feet on the grass. Take a few breaths in the dark and look at the moon. If you can't see the moon, look at the stars.
Yeah. Even just a couple of minutes.
Just close your eyes. Like, you know,
go inward and then experience the environment around you.
And I guess if you don't have grass and you can't go to a park, then put some Epsom salt in your bath and just soak.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds lovely. Especially, you know, cold season, people are getting kind of scratchy throats and stuff around a lot late. Around here, they have a lot of people have. I had a friend just tell me this morning when she was living in Germany, she would go to the doctor and be like, I'm getting a cold. I'm getting these things. She's like, you know, expecting kind of the American response of like, well, here's a prescription for these things. And the German doctor wrote her a prescription, gave it to her. She took it to the pharmacy or chemist, and they were like, oh, yeah, this is an eucalyptus bath, and put together a little package of eucalyptus and Epsom salts and was like, here, go take a bath.
That sounds so wonderful.
I'm like, that's great. That's my kind of jam. Yeah. So for some of us that are celebrating, and some of the things we're going to be doing at Nourishing Kin that has helped me adopt that into my family and what we do, we're going to be making besoms. So for I've been at the last, oh my gosh, how many Mabons has it been now? 3 or 4?
Yeah, you've been able, because you're down there. You get to go all
I'm down there, so I can do it in person.
One. I did all the online ones, but I've only ever been able to attend one in-person one, and that was last October.
I know, I'm trying to think. I think this is our third year. We're about to start. So I've been at every Mabon with Nourishing Kin. I think that was the very first one we did too. And the last 2 years we've done besoms. So we make a witch's broom. We take a bunch of natural dried things, leaves, whatever, and we tie them to a stick. We can put charms on them. We can decorate it. The first one I made, I actually left there at the campsite because I couldn't find it in the dark.
Oh dear.
Oops. So I didn't get to keep it, but I made one last year, and it's been sitting in my house all year, collecting energy, you know. I like to use the brooms, especially if I like buy the scented ones, cinnamon scented ones and stuff, and I put them over my doorways. And I use it intentionally for collecting energy as it comes through the door, sweeping energy out, you know, when people leave, so that they're kind of cleansed as they walk through my doorway.
I haven't made one at Nourishing Kin, but I did go and I made one, and it is
Yeah.
a hanging at my back door.
Yes.
And then sometimes I just kind of take it off and I just kind of go around my house and sweep the air because I'm like, we got to clear some stuff out.
Yeah, it works. You know, before I even studied any energy work whatsoever, I did that intuitively. I just started to be like, oh, there is some stagnant yuck in this house. Like everybody's at each other's throats. Everybody is mad at each other. So I'm like, we're just going to go around and collect the energy. And I would pick it like cobwebs out of the corners and just go like this. And then we would push it out the door. And now I do that with the broom. But this is a great time, you know, just to create a ritual. And there's no, you know, hard and fast rule about this, but we like to burn ours in the campfire and then make a new one so that you have like cleanse the energy of the old year and welcome the new energy of the new year, and, you know, kind of a ritual of starting over. A lot of us that have altars in our house, we will take, like you were saying, pulling cards for the season, and then decorate your altar with those cards and some things like wheat and corn and items that kind of represent this time of year as your offering, candles to burn, things like that, certain colors that remind you of this time of year. And so that's, you know, not necessarily that it has to have a direct correlation to ancient traditions, but just that we are kind of the ancestors of our descendants. We get to kind of make what we feel is going to honor ourselves, honor the goddess, if you so choose, or source, and honor the time of year. Just honor like this place in your life, right? Now, because you are the author of Lunar Wisdom, this is something that I've been trying to kind of use more and more in my healing work, whether it's for self or for clients. But I like to think of this as like the quarter moon phase of going into the dark moon. Like this is the time of year that you're going into your descent, right? Like going into shadow work, if you will. You're just looking at what is confronting, you know.
And most of the shadow
seem
work,
to be more stressed than usual.
Like most of the shadow work will happen when the sun is in Scorpio, but we're preparing for that, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Right. Because the sun is in Virgo right now, and it will change and go into Scorpio.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, and you can do that in every moon cycle. In just being able to kind of, which is what I've been doing this past year, is just, I'm not super great at like astrology. I'm not super knowledgeable about all the things, but just being more aware of like, okay, so we're at this point in the moon cycle, and then just taking kind of a note of how I feel, what's coming up, because I've started to notice patterns.
So we are actually, so if we're talking current moon, right, we're coming along to the first quarter moon. And at each quarter moon is a time to really be grateful and to kind of assess if what you want is what you really want. And you start to kind of have conflicts around the quarter moons. Right. And the first quarter moon are a lot of like external conflicts. So maybe with people more, or like things outside of you. And then when you're having the third quarter moon, because it's after the full moon and you're going down again, then that's more internal. Right. So, you know, but we're actually coming on to the first quarter moon now. So it's kind of like, okay.
Yes. So when this episode releases, so we're coming into, this episode's going to release more closer to the equinox, which is why I'm recording it now. So it'll be coming out after
the full moon. So things will be waning and we'll be going internal, which is also what. And that's what we're doing. Then that's Mabon itself, is that waning and going internal. Yes. So, yeah.
It's sort of like, just like, you know, we have these cycles throughout every month, and we have these cycles of dissent. We're confronting things. We're going through our You know, a confrontation stage can be like difficult because you're confronting all those shadows that you're like, oh, I was really trying to avoid that. I didn't really want to look at that part of myself, or things like that. It also kind of follows the cycle of the wheel of the year. So yeah, like Mabon is kind of the descent into, this is when we're coming into our dark period. Not necessarily dark in a bad way that it's going to be that hard, but just like, what does this, you know, time of year mean for you? For me, it's going to be a lot more rest, I hope.
Resting. And I think the thing too is we want like acceptance, because when we talk about shadow work and whatever, when people will talk about that, and it's like, and it's not like the bad parts of you, it's just the parts of you that you haven't learned to love.
Yeah.
And
I love that.
We live in a society that's hustle and push, right? And as women, it's really hard to go, I need to rest. Like, my monthly cycle is waning and I have less energy. I need to rest, but I still have to go to work. I still have to take care of my kids. I still have to get them to school. I still have to do all these things. And so this is where we go, okay, I'm going to love the part of me that is tired and needs to rest and is saying no today. I'm going to love the part of me that is overly emotional and cannot deal with this right now, because I get to have a rest, and then I'll be okay. And so when we do shadow work, and so we go in Scorpio season, it's going to be a lot of deep shadow stuff and a lot of ancestral stuff, because that's when the veil is thinner. But this is the best time now to go, what is it that really I don't accept about myself that I need to learn to love and work with?
Yes. Yeah. And I find, I don't know about anybody else, audience can write in their answers here, but I feel like it's going to confront you no matter what. Like, whether you're conscious of it and saying, oh, I'm noticing this pattern, I'm noticing, you know, we're coming into Scorpio and we're doing, and this is what's going to happen. I feel like it's going to find a way in some way, shape, or form to bring itself to you and say, this is something you need to look at.
Yeah. And then
I had that happen just this last weekend. My husband and I were a little bit at each other's throats, and I was like, I'm going to need to look at that for a second and see why that's happening.
Yes. And it's also okay to say, that's interesting and I need to look at it, and I'm really tired right now.
Yeah.
And I will schedule a time to look at it, because maybe it gets thrown in your face. And I don't know about you, but when things get thrown in my face, there's usually multiple. And now's not the time of year that have the bandwidth to solve everything, but to just start taking steps.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm discovering my Pisces self really needs to learn how to say no to things and give myself that opportunity to rest. And so I feel like when I'm coming into winter, I used to dread it so much, because I love the sun being out. I love long days and warm weather. That's all usually been my favorite time of year. But I found myself getting more depressed this year during spring, because I was kind of like, actually, I loved the opportunity to hibernate.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's less expectation on me. Less people were asking me for help or what they needed, and I was able to just kind of take care of me. Yeah. And I adopt a lot of tasks, I guess. I have the tendency to be like, when people are like, do you want to be part of this project? And I'm like, yes. Do you want to be a part of this project? And I'm like, absolutely. Do you want to do this with me? Yes. I want to do all the things. And then I'm like, wow, I am so overwhelmed. Yeah. And I don't want to let anyone down. So I'm like, I'm doing all the things.
Who do you let down? You let yourself down, because
I do.
You're so exhausted and you're so overwhelmed, and then you're snappy at the people you love the most, or the thing that you really wanted to do to nourish your soul. You don't have time to now.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, that's going to be my lesson this coming into this next winter. I will just end with saying, yes, this is all part of, for those of us who are in the healing community and use a lot of these aspects of paganism as healing work, that is probably the biggest takeaway I want to leave with people is to take note of what this season feels like to you in going into dissent. And just as a historical side note aspect, the Celtic people didn't necessarily mark the equinoxes as much as they did even some of the more in between. Different aspects of paganism from different come-froms had their own experience around it, but Celtic specifically, they were like, yeah, it's the equinox. We're all a little bit too busy harvesting to really do anything about it.
You got work to do.
We got work to do. So yeah, like Ostera and Easter wasn't necessarily a time that they would do a lot of celebrating either, because they were like, we're busy, we're planting.
We got work to
do. So it was more like Beltane, Calan and Samhain or Calan Gaeaf that marked like the beginning of winter and the beginning of summer. It was sort of like light half the year, dark half of the year, which is not necessarily an equinox or a solstice, but that's just something interesting that you might want to note. If you're feeling guilty because you don't do anything special, or you're like, I don't even really notice that this time has come and gone, don't worry.
Well, that's fine.
Yeah, to each their own. And celebrate whatever you feel.
And I know, and I didn't get to go to the last Nurse and Kin, but I know they talked about our own personal astrology and how that affects us. So if you know astrology, if your rising sign is at a different time of the year, you might be totally opposite, and that's okay.
Yeah.
So you can follow yourself. And it's kind of like with the moon, a lot of women are more into tracking and going with their own personal monthly cycle. But if you don't have one anymore, then you go with the moon, or, you just trust yourself. Trust yourself to do what works for you. Honestly, for me, I'm so all over the place because I'm like in my late 40s. So I don't know what's coming.
Right. Yeah. That's been me since I was 16. So
yeah. So you just do what works and trust yourself.
Yeah. And if you miss it entirely and don't mark it in any way,
just go try something else. And honestly, a lot of times for me, marking the seasons is just making myself a cup of tea with herbs that just feel more aligned with this season. Like for the summertime, I'd never done like a sun tea before, which is where you put the tea in the jar and then you will sit it in the sun to steep. And I'm so excited. Yeah. That's the only thing I did that day. But I was like, I went out and I put my thing out in the morning, and then that afternoon I added the ice and I had my sun tea. And it was like, I just honored that it's the longest day of the year and the sun is shining and crops are growing. And that was all I did.
And that's good enough. Yeah. It doesn't have to be elaborate. And ritual is literally, there can be ritual in just about anything. And where people are like, oh, I don't have like time or resources or I don't know how to create a ritual. I think just that, make a sun tea on summer solstice and notice the long day. That's it. Just notice it. Just take note. Can be a ritual. So
a ritual that I have in my phone, 1:00 on Monday, my alarm goes off. And all I do is when it goes off, I just stop and I take 3 breaths and exhale. That's it.
I love that.
It doesn't, anything can happen anywhere. I could be anywhere. And it's just like, oh, okay. It just reminds me. You could set one daily. I just went with weekly.
Yeah.
So
perfect.
Well,
so with that, I would like to give us an opportunity to, as we're closing up, just how to find us. Let's start with you. How can your fans and people who are now new fans of yours because they heard you today on our podcast and said, I want to read all of the books this lady has to offer, where can they find you and what?
I have Facebook and Instagram as Amanda Norr. And then my books are just under Amanda Norr. But I did the B. That's like my maiden name / middle name. And so Facebook and Instagram, and then on those, like, especially on my Instagram, I have a link tree. And I have it, I have it posted both places, and like I share it fairly often. I've been a little silent on my social medias just because I've been doing a lot of internal stuff and not feeling so out there, but I'm
yeah, I get that.
and so there's links on the link tree to all the books. And they're all in paperback now. So last month, the fourth one came out in paperback, and the last three, they're a series. So I'll talk about that in just a second. But there's some links to some other podcasts I've done, some other interviews and things I've done. I will link Courtney on there too. And I do have a Facebook group that's Moonwork with Amanda that people can be in. It's kind of quiet, but I try to post things and ask questions there. And then my services and everything are linked on. And so I'm still building, I'm still growing as a business person, and so still having to do real life, not so fun stuff, but hey.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
if you're anything like me, those of us who are like in the mystical world, the business stuff is the hardest part.
Yes. And then when you're also in the healing world and you're doing your own healing, like trying to be out there to be like, oh, I got to post this thing and I got to show up at that thing. Like, it's just like, I don't have the bandwidth.
It's so hard.
Right now. So, right. Cause I'm working on my 5th book, which is Lunar Magic. And I have written 4 sentences in February, and I haven't written anything since. So
I'm already intrigued.
And it's so
I'm ready.
This is the really pretty, you know.
I saw the cover. That's so
I'm
pretty.
so excited for the companion. And this is my favorite. It was like Christmas morning to see it because it's co-authored. So there's 14 authors in it.
Yes.
And we all have a different take, but it's like a workbook. And I use all of it. And then when I go back and read my chapter and I'm not really thinking like, these are my words, I will cry and I will be like, oh my gosh. And then I was like, oh, I wrote that. Like it. I guess I really inspiration. It really, and writing this one, it was magic. It was like I was in the mood to write, or I wasn't in the mood to write. But it always seemed like when I was in the mood to write, the sky was the same as what was going on the paper. My feelings were processing. It was just,
yeah,
you couldn't have made a better journey. It was crazy. So, and then my other 3 books, they're a series. It's called the Wounded Women series. So it's dealing with collective trauma and processing. So they can be a bit heavy. So a chapter at a time and self-care. The first one was Betrayed. And that one's like the synopsis, I guess, is like the sister wound of being, you know, like, because in our society, in our system, women get at each other, right?
Yeah.
It's like a pecking order.
Yeah.
And there's can be a problem there. And so it's overcoming that, whether it's your own sister was written in there, whether it's friends. For me, it was hard to write because it was just like the betrayed of like my mother figures, not necessarily my mother, but women, you know, being groomed and taught what I was.
Yes.
This is the path to follow. And then doing that to my own daughter, and then my daughter breaking free. And then I'm like, oh, well, cool. Like, I'm so proud of her. And then figuring out how I need to break myself out of that too, to perpetuate, you know, like, no, you get married, you have babies, you do this for your husband.
Yes.
If, you know, you can have your own things as long as it doesn't interfere with him. And I think it's just learning how to be a partner. And I still love my children. I wouldn't not have my children, but would I have had them at 18 and 20? Like,
yeah.
So anyway, so there's that one. And so, and my part was really hard to write, but there was a lot of processing. Like, this stuff was work. So now I'm trying to get back to magic for Lunar Magic. Then Broken.
Yes.
Breaking generational traumas, patterns, the mother wound.
Yes.
And I was like, well, that's hard for me because I still feel like I have like the best mom. When my friends are struggling with dealing with their moms, and I'm like, I do not compute. My mom is amazing. And so for me, I think the mother wound a lot was like, I'm not as good as a mom as my mom was. I don't feel like I make my kids feel the way my mom made me feel, or still makes me feel. And so there's that. And so I just talked about like the generational pass down of worrying. Like my great grandmother, like worried about everything. My grandma worried about a lot of things, but less things than her mom. And my mom worried about even a lot of things, but less than her mom. And then I came and I'm like, how can I worry about less and pass on less to my daughter?
Yes.
And then taking family traditions that I wanted to incorporate everything, but feeling incapable of it. And so keeping what worked to share with my kids about our family traditions, but being able to let go and make new ones. So that was what I wrote about in that book. And I wrote this amazing poem in there that everybody really liked. Like, I'll brag about it a little. And I had written it actually a couple years before, because it felt, when I wrote it, like my ancestresses were singing this to me. And so it was like, I had to go in there. And then the third book is Burned. And initially in the subtitle, it talked about the witch wound. I'll just read it. It's brave and inspiring stories from women who have overcome their fears to speak their truth and share their wisdom. But
Perfect.
it's still the witch wound. And I actually am chapter 1 in that, because again, I wrote another poem because just the concept of the book, and I wasn't going to contribute to this one. I was just going to do the other two, but just the processing. And I had written this poem and I sent it to my friend and she's the one publishing it. And she's like, we want that. It has to be. And so then they made that chapter 1. And then I put a little bit of like a prose narrative with still what I'm struggling, because I still find myself in certain groups where I can't speak out fully as myself because it doesn't fit with their narrative of society and that vulnerability and all that kind of fun stuff.
Amazing.
I'm still seeing, well, and then honestly, like there's like countries still now that are burning women and killing women for being witches. And they're usually the elderly and the very, vulnerable. But I even see in our society, and we see it on social media, and we see it where when someone is brave to share their story, and they're not directing anything at anybody, like, this is my story. And it's like they're being fried in social media. They're being fried in public because they dare speak out on something that somebody else didn't like.
Yeah. And I would dare say, and it's kind of interesting, I'm reading The Defense of Witches, In Defense of Witches. And as you're saying, these wounds, sister wound and mother wound and witch wound, you could almost lump that into all of it being witch wounds. Like we learned from those trials and from oppression of women to turn on each other, like it's all part of one large network of betrayal and systems that the patriarchy have put us in.
And then we pass down that trauma, right? So we turn on each other and then we continually pass that trauma down through generations. Oh,
shame and fear.
And then just speaking out, like, it can be so healing, and yet it can be so detrimental, and how to have your voice.
Well, just so everybody knows, I'm going to have a link to all of those social media accounts and the link tree and Amazon. Your books will be on my blog for this episode. So when this episode comes out and airs,
also on my link tree, there is a space to join and like get my newsletter. And I send out a newsletter every month on this is when the new moon is, and this is what you can do around the new moon. And I'm like, hey, take 3 days before to 3 days after. You don't stress if you're busy the day. And then I also do
thank goodness.
I'm like, and honestly, it's better to do full moon stuff just after new moon stuff just after the new moon, and the full moon, like, oh, the full moon's coming in like a few days. Like, I'm gonna get all this crap out now. Like, but if you're like, oh crap, it's the moon, I missed it. Like, no, you didn't. I mean, you're in like 6 days.
Those emails are very helpful to me in being able to keep track of where I'm at in my cycles. I do not have menstrual cycles. So for me, it's like the reminders, the emails, the newsletters, it's all very helpful. And I rarely do anything on the day of anything.
Oh, I don't either. Like, and the last few months, it's all of a sudden I'm just sitting there and I'm looking at the calendar like, oh, okay, yeah, I need to, or like, so. Yeah, I just do what I can. And sometimes I like to do tactile things to help me, and like write things out, burn it, bury it, whatever. And the last few months, my bandwidth has been, I'm just going to think about this for a few minutes. because that's all
Perfect.
I've been able to do. So
Just gonna visualize it. And
I like to only send one out a month because I don't like to, pester. So you get the new moon, the full moon, and it kind of rotates. It's usually like a few days before the new moon. Here's your new moon stuff.
Yeah.
Get on that.
Perfect.
But I sometimes will send out like an extra email to be like, hey, I've got this, new book coming out, just so you're aware, or, whatever. So, but I don't do that super often. And it's been in my works and in my brain. I want to put together a program that really utilizes the quarter moons, because that's where all the tension lies.
Yeah.
But it's
often gets overlooked too.
I gotta get back into the lunar magic to get that book done, because I'm not even sure what I'm writing about. It's about using the moon and having magic daily, which for some people that gets really overwhelming, and so it's like simple things. So not really sure what I'm writing about.
I love that. I think that's perfect. I think that's great. And thank you so much for all that work that you do and putting those books into being, helping to get those stories out. Those stories of those women are powerful. I've read quite a lot of it myself, and love the the collaboration and the what's the word I'm looking for? Just cohesiveness, or we're all individual. We have such individual stories, but at the same time, those themes are universal. Yeah. Like, it's not something that we're just now getting to awareness of in this generation. It's something that has happened, and we're connected to our ancestors who've been through those experiences and cycles.
That's why I like this format with the books, because I write a chapter, which means a lot to me, and I get a lot of great feedback from that, but I get to read everybody else's story, and then we'll get together and have like author calls and communicate. And it's just like, we're all just there holding each other and lifting each other. And it's a very amazing experience.
I love it. Maybe someday, if I ever get around to writing that book that I've got stewing around in my head, but that sounds like an amazing experience to be able to write that way. And speaking of full moon, I do have my full moon Healing Through Art course is starting in October. So anyone listening now who's local in the South Jordan area wants to join, I'm only opening 6 spots, but I would like, what I've planned to do with that course is to have at least an online group supporting each other during the quarter moon, phases of the month. And I like to partner that with the Avalonian moon cycles. So you'll get some of that mythology to go to partner with it. The Mythic Moons of Avalon book that we know about so well. I kind of, took these resources and I pulled them together, and I said, why don't we do an emotional process every month around the full moon? It's usually a couple days before. But it's like, we're going to do that to kind of set ourselves up for the month and how we can support each other through the month. So if anyone's interested in that, look for me on my website. I'm at prism-healing.com. I'm also on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. I try to post as often as possible and get out there in the world. And so you could find me at any of those places. I would like to thank Amanda for joining us today and being co-host with me. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation that we've had, and that you feel like you've been a part of our little discussion and our little world here. And I'm going to shout out a thank you to Jess Blaine at Ride the Wave Media for producing this podcast. And I will see you next time. Witches and wizards, go make magic.